Good morning, everybody. You're very welcome to the Dublin Festival of History. To some of you, welcome back. I know you were here yesterday and possibly on Friday, which is great to see. And for those who are here for the first time, thank you very much for coming out on a Sunday morning to take part in our 11th Dublin Festival of History, which is put together by Dublin City Council through our library service and through the Dublin City Council Culture Company. One of the projects we're very proud of in the libraries and in the Culture Company is our Historians in Residence programme. And the Historians in Residence latest edition of History on Your Doorstep, the book that we produce every year, is being launched after this immediately by the Lord Mayor at 12 o'clock out in the foyer. We'll have a little bit of a celebration and you're all very welcome to join us for that, and I hope you will. We've lots more events, of course, later today in Dublin Castle and also for the next 2 weeks around our branch libraries and lots of other venues around the city. I do hope you'll have a look at the website. It does have the latest information, dublinfestivalofhistory.ie. So to our first session today, obviously over the past decade we've been dealing with lots of issues to do with the revolutionary period, 1916, War of Independence, the Civil War. And today we're going to look at the land border topic, a subject which of course persists to this day and is still a lively issue for us all on the island. We have three excellent historians, Cormac Moore, who's one of our historians in residence, Diarmaid Ferriter and Síobhra Aiken. And to moderate it, we have Ronan McGreevy. Ronan is an Irish Times journalist and author. His latest book, co-written with Tommy Conlon, is called The Kidnapping, and it's about the kidnapping of Don Tidy, and that will be out on the 26th of October. So Ronan is going to introduce the panels in more detail, so please welcome your Irish Land Border panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's fantastic to see such a crowd here so early in the morning. So the land border between Northern and Southern Ireland was originally intended as an administrative border between two devolved parts of the United Kingdom. But on December the 6th, 1922, the Irish Free State came into being. A day later, the Northern Ireland Parliament exercised its prerogative to opt out of any 32-county arrangement. It's there we take up the story with a very knowledgeable trio of guests. It should be said that today in itself is a historic day, as it is the day that the Green and Red Lanes come into being in Northern Ireland as part of the Windsor Framework. So the border is still a very current issue. As we take up the story early in 1923 with a very knowledgeable trio of guests, they are Professor of History at UCD, Diarmaid Ferriter. Among his books are The Border, The Legacy of a Century of Anglo-Irish Politics. Dublin City Council Historian Residence, Dr. Cormac Moore, the author of The Birth of the Border, and Queen's University Belfast lecturer, Dr. Síobhra Aiken, whose book Spiritual Wounds, Trauma, Testimony and the Irish Civil War recently won the 2023 Whitbread Prize by the Royal Historical Society. So, Diarmaid, let's start with you first. 1923 is the first full year of partitioning of the border. What did it look like then?
It looked like a right mess in lots of ways. Do you remember that village where the border ran down the street with the butcher and the baker in different states? They were the lines from a Paul Muldoon poem in 1980, and he was trying to encapsulate that sense of obvious division but also complete inconvenience and the arbitrary nature of the border. The decision to establish the border using county lines created all sorts of complications. These were county boundaries that had been established in the 16th and the 17th centuries, and much had built up around them. So you're talking about hinterlands, in some cases farms and even individual houses being divided by the border. And it provides a great source of relief and comfort and reassurance for some. It's a complete affront for others who associate it with incarceration. But I think even leaving aside the obvious political divisions between Unionists and Nationalists, it created all sorts of daily inconveniences for people as well. So it looked a right mess in many ways. Northern Ireland, as it had become, also had a very dense rural road network, and it was estimated that there were about 180 of those roads that traversed the border. So that in itself was a complication. How do you police that? How do you monitor it? Only a handful of them became approved border roads. But there were other crossings. I mean, there were really, in reality, over 200 crossings of the border. It was a border of, I would say, meandering complexity. I was quite amused at a much later stage to read files, archival files, bearing witness to Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s complaining bitterly about a border on the island of Ireland that was full of kinks and wiggles. And she asked the question, why can't we have a straight line border? And I mean, these were not just Irish themes. We should remind ourselves of that. There's an awful lot of borders that are contested in the period after the First World War. And there was a real sense of grievance on the part of those who felt they were on the wrong side of the border.
Cormac, how did the Free State government, which came into being in December 1922, what was its reaction to the border?
First of all, it didn't agree with it, as was, if you look at the treaty negotiations, the two main signatories, they, as a kind of compromise, they did agree to a boundary commission, and they genuinely believed this boundary commission was going to change the border fundamentally, in that you'd have Tyrone, Fermanagh back in the Free State, you'd have Derry City, Newry, loads of big tracts of land from Northern Ireland would be back in the Free State, and the rest would be a non-viable rump. So they would have a united Ireland. That was the myopic, naive viewpoint of most of Free State, Cumann Gael politicians. So when Collins and Griffith died, it became the responsibility of Cosgrave and Kevin O'Higgins and Ernest Bligh. And they had a very different policy towards the North than Collins did. Now, Collins cared deeply about the North. In fact, Lloyd George said they could, to Winston Churchill, we can get Collins to speak about nothing else but the North. But his policies were all over the place. In 1 minute he was arming the IRA, and second minute he was talking about peace with Craig, signing 2 pacts with Craig in January, March 22. And he led the obstructionist tactics of the Free State government for nationalists in the North to ignore schools, to ignore the courts, to ignore the local authorities. And they actually paid quite a bit of money to teachers and other professionals who ignored and obstructed Northern institutions. Once Collins and Griffith were out of the way, that even before Collins died, the Free State government decided to change tact. They were going to have a policy of peaceful nothingness, basically, as Kevin O'Shiel coined the phrase. They weren't going to pay for teachers anymore. They were going to have okay relationships with the Northern government, acknowledge it for a start, that it existed, and try and have forged better relationships. And they were going to pin all their policy on the Boundary Commission, the treaty, essentially. So once the Civil War started, they could come out in the open and support the treaty openly, as opposed to try and reach a common ground with the anti-treaty side. Once the Civil War started, the treaty was the only show in town from the Free State government perspective. So they pinned all their hopes on the Boundary Commission once Ulster opted out of the Free State, which it obviously did in December 1922.
So just to clarify for our audience here, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, Article 12 of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, sets up a boundary commission to determine the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State. But there's a caveat there, it depends on economic conditions. Geographical conditions, yeah. Síobhra, the Civil War continued in the South until May 1923, and obviously your great-grandfather's decision to the dump arms prerogative was the end of the Civil War. To what extent was that a distraction for the South from dealing with the issue of partition?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the first thing actually to mention is the terminology of the Civil War. When we refer to the Civil War, that's referring to the war between the two factions of the IRA that split over the terms of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. But if we look at the newspaper reporting from the period, we have the word Civil War being used in reporting, particularly in what is now Northern Ireland, to I suppose, denote the tensions between nationalists and Unionists in the north. So in a way we have two civil wars, or multiple civil wars happening during this period. In terms of whether or not the Civil War is a distraction from partition, I think you could look at it that in one sense. I think what Cormac mentioned there was the fact that by the time the Civil War erupts, there is a sense that there will be a boundary commission, that the treaty has secured that, and in a way it's put on hold to come back to. But equally we could turn it back and flip it around and say that partition was something that delayed the Civil War and was just a distraction from the Civil War. So when the Civil War erupted in June 1922, when the Four Courts are bombarded, the anti-treaty IRA have occupied the Four Courts, and the Free State Army bombarded the Four Courts, that's essentially the beginning of these hostilities. That could have erupted earlier had it not been for attempts to unite these two forces over the question of the border. So from the spring of 1922, we actually have quietly the leaders of the pro and anti-treaty sides collaborating militarily, working to transport guns for this northern offensive. And there's a border war during those months where we have collaboration between these two, the splits between the two sides. And we also find then that is happening right up until May 1922 with the Balik-Pettigo incident, where we have Free State soldiers and anti-treaty Republicans working together on this operation. So I suppose there's multiple areas happening during this period. So in we can say it both ways. Both the Civil War is a distraction; it takes away from the question of the border, and equally the question of the border is central. And just another point on all of this, I guess, is that there tends to be a tendency of separating the Civil War from the question of the North, because, as Cormac said, there was a hope, an expectation that this would be resolved at a later date through the Boundary Commission. But equally, the question of the North is really running through all of the events that lead to the outbreak of the Civil War. There are refugees from Belfast across Dublin as the battle for Dublin. This battle occurs in June 1922 between pro and anti-treaty Republicans. And in a way, they're fighting against each other to accommodate these refugees as best they can. There's a bit of a split. Equally, what leads to the bombardment of the Four Courts, one of the events leading up to it anyway, is the kidnapping of Ginger O'Connell, who's on the Free State side, in retaliation for the arrest of Leo Henderson, who's on the anti-treaty side. And the reason Leo Henderson is arrested by Free State soldiers is because he was enforcing the Belfast boycott in Dublin. So the Belfast boycott was a boycott on any businesses, Dublin businesses, that were collaborating with businesses in Belfast. And this was a boycott in order to protest against the way in which Catholics are being treated in the North. So we have this all leading up to the Civil War. And then the last point, I suppose, maybe Ronan, you can come into this, is the assassination of Henry Wilson in June 22 in London. Which really is a trigger point for the Civil War. This leads to pressure being put on the pro-treaty side to deal with this anti-treaty faction. And one of the reasons that is cited for the assassination of Sir Henry Wilson in London is because he was associated with the mistreatment of Catholics in the North. Whether you can go into this yourself in more detail, but we see this in the testimonies in the Bureau of Military History, that this is being cited as one of the reasons why Sir Henry Wilson is assassinated.
Diarmaid, to what extent was the border in 1923? We know, looking back, that it was far more permanent than people thought. But to what extent was it, to paraphrase Albert Reynolds, a temporary little arrangement, or was regarded as such by people in Ireland?
The border was never supposed to be permanent. What happened over the course of the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations between October and December 1921 was that the British government wanted to get Ulster off the table so that the talks wouldn't break down on the issue of Ulster, which in itself is interesting because it suggested that they didn't have a strong case, and they saw that themselves. Some of them were prepared to admit in private that the division of such a small island was indefensible, but they had a very obvious political problem. How do you force Ulster in? How do you force Unionists in against their will? In this democratic day and this democratic age, as they sometimes stressed, so they want to get rid of it, and that's how they come up with the Boundary Commission idea. And Arthur Griffith is really stitched in to that idea by David Lloyd George. And the idea was that according to David Lloyd George, and we can jump into the treaty negotiations courtesy of Tom Jones, who was the cabinet secretary, David Lloyd George's secretary, because he kept very detailed diaries, and you can see the horse trading that's going on. And this idea is being pushed that this is not going to be permanent, that the Boundary Commission will review this question. And the Irish delegation were given the impression, in Tom Jones's words, that Ulster, Northern Ireland, would be forced in by economic necessity, or would be so cut down, as he put it, that it would be forced in. So they were creating that impression that this was a kind of a temporary issue, and that they needed to try and come up with that in order to progress the other issues in relation to the wider question of empire and so on. And even, we should remember this, James Craig had not shut the door completely on the idea of all-Ireland arrangements. And he spoke to his own party, the Unionist party, and said, well, perhaps in 25 or 50 or even 75 years we may come to some accommodation. And he met Michael Collins too in 1922. So he wasn't shutting the door completely. And there was this idea as well of a Council of Ireland, that it could be used to bring the two sides together. And of course that was resurrected at different stages and became very contentious, because it was always seen as very threatening by Unionists. So it is not seen as a permanent border. Obviously the Civil War complicates things. There's also a sense that the new Free State government has such problems of establishing the legitimacy of its new state and stability therein that they can't really afford to be preoccupied with Ulster. But there was also a great sense of betrayal then on the part of Northern Nationalists, that they were being abandoned. And they certainly, of course, wanted to see progress to demonstrate that this was going to be a temporary little arrangement. But the problems of 1923 onwards meant that the border became cemented relatively quickly, and there was an economic dimension to that, as well as political dimensions. And it becomes very much a mantra for Unionists that what we have, we hold. And that is one of the dominant slogans for James Craig. So whatever he might have been entertaining in private about the long term, in public it was going to be very much a defiant defence of the 6 counties.
Cormac, you write a regular column for the Irish News, focus on mostly on historical events, and you wrote a couple of very interesting ones recently, especially one about how the Free State government sought to exploit the border for financial purposes in 1923. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't use the term exploit the border for financial purposes. There was a big dilemma for the Free State government in that one of the biggest achievements of the treaty, and it's hardly ever talked about, is a decision by Lloyd George at very late in the night or early in the morning, 5th, 6th December, he finally conceded on giving the Free State fiscal autonomy. And this is something that nationalists of all strains had been asking for since the Third Home Rule crisis erupted in the early 1910s. And because you don't really have independence if you don't have control over your finances. So instead of the British Treasury controlling Irish Free State finances, this will be in the hands of the revenue commissioners in Dublin instead. So it's a huge win, and you cannot give that up very easily. Michael Collins said to a journalist from the Evening Standard, shortly after the treaty was signed, we waited until the last moment, and once Lloyd George conceded on that, myself and Mr. Griffith ready to sign. It's the most important part of the treaty.
And it's something that's completely overlooked. Really.
Overlooked completely, yeah. But the Free State, as Diarmaid mentioned, it had its own massive problems for most of 1922, trying to govern its own territory. It wasn't in a position to have fiscal independence, so it agreed an arrangement with the British government that the British Treasury would look after the finances of the Free State until the end of the financial year 22-23, which fell on the 31st of March, 1st of April. So it got fiscal independence, which it deserved and it needed, but there's a big problem with that. Its public rhetoric of wanting United Ireland went against that, because that, by having fiscal independence, it meant you had to put a border ring around the whole Free State. Now that was fine with ports. There already was an infrastructure there, but there was no infrastructure on the, from Lough Foyle to Lough Carney for that meandering. What's it Margaret Thatcher called it? Squiggles and
Wiggles.
Squiggles and wiggles, yeah. That you had to put the paraphernalia, the physical infrastructure of a border. And the Free State did that. It was the Free State decisions to do that. So by March 1923, You have all these customs posts coming up, you've got farms, you've got a whole new kind of infrastructure, and the whole way of life, as Diarmaid alluded to at the start, it just changed overnight for people living at the border. The Clonus was a thriving market town. It's lost most of its business from Fermanagh overnight. And this was a decision by the Free State government. So on the one hand, it wanted fiscal independence, which it was entitled to and it needed, but it affected its policies on the north in that it compromised the border. In fact, as its advisors and the revenue commissioners, CJ Flint said to Cosgrave, this is going to stereotype the border before the Boundary Commission even sits. Are you sure you want to do this?
Yeah, so to get it straight, on the 1st of April 1923, there's basically a hard border erected on the island of Ireland at various crossing points by the Free State.
It was unapproved, so Diarmaid mentioned about 200 crossings.
Yeah.
There was only about between 12 and 16 roads you were allowed to travel from 9 to 5 on Monday to Saturday, not on Sundays, nor public holidays. You weren't allowed to travel those with goods. And there was customs posts put up, there was boundary posts put up, there was, there was roads trenched. So literally you cannot cross the border without being checked.
And you would think as well, I suppose one of the things that we sort of forget is that customs and excise revenues was the most important source of revenue for governments at that time before income tax was really... So that was regarded as a serious...
Well, for the year 1921, for Ireland as an island, one entity, 64% of revenue was from customs and excise, whereas only 30% was from, 20-something% was for income tax.
Yeah.
So obviously, like a lot of people didn't have jobs or paying tax for jobs back in the early 20s, whereas customs and excise was a big revenue generator.
Was there any pushback on either side of the border against the imposition of these border posts?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, obviously, on the border towns, the best source I would say is probably the National Archives witness statements on the Boundary Commission that met from late 24 to mid 25, and it gives witness statements from both Nationalists and Unionists, and all of them without fail talked about the horrors of the customs posts, how it affected their lives. They could see a railway station outside their door, but they weren't allowed to go right to it. They had to go a meandering road about 4 or 5 miles to get to a railway station because the road was closed. These kind of stories and how it affected people doing business, which kind of their hinterland was over in a lot of cases. Louth was cut off from Armagh and down, Derry from Donegal, Monaghan from Fermanagh, and it affected everyone's lives. So the Nationalists wanted the border to be brought up forward, so Newry would be included in the Free State and other areas, whereas Unionists said, no, we want the border to stay as it is. Well, we'll take East Donegal as well, but ultimately we prefer the border to stay as it is, because we don't want to, have to have boundary posts and customs posts with our hinterland.
But why did the Free State government move with such unseemly haste to erect these posts when the Boundary Commission hadn't even started its deliberation?
Well, partly because the Civil War had costed nearly £50 million.
So it was a financial decision.
It wasn't just financial. It wasn't just financial.
But there are pressing economic concerns, and of course, the new Northern Ireland administration is being subvented. So it doesn't quite have the same kind of economic pressures. It's interesting as well that David Lloyd George, as Prime Minister, had said to James Craig during the treaty negotiations period that a border was going to, as in his words, cut off the natural circuits of commercial activity. So even before those border postings are put in place, there's a recognition that this could be economically complicated for a small island.
But Hugh Pollak, the finance minister, first finance minister of Northern Ireland, he said, look, we don't want a border. They wanted, like the Unionists they really did not like this idea of a border at all. And James Craig said there was no partition before the Free State put up this border, which wasn't correct. But he did say, but they wanted Ireland, all of Ireland, to remain within the British Customs Union, which the Free State were never going to do. But Hugh Pollak did say, okay, if you are going to have a border, we prefer to stay within the fiscal space of 40 million people as opposed to 4 million people. So you can have your border, but you're going to lose out more than we are. Because our trade is east-west, not north-south, more so.
I'm sure we could just as well be talking about Brexit now.
Yeah, we could. We'll come on to that in a minute. Síobhra, what was the attitude of the Northern government to partition at this time?
Yeah, well, I think we've alluded to it there, that it was the Free State government by putting up these posts in the spring of 1923 that ultimately consolidates the border in a physical sense. In terms of the Unionist government, I'd say that the reaction or the view on the border was defensive, that this was something that was born out of necessity rather than of a choice, I guess. When King George V came to honour the Government of Ireland Act in 1920, what he said in Belfast was, this is no to home rule. So this immediately partition and the border is not something that is necessarily desired, but it's the best outcome, it's the best option, it's the alternative to home rule. And then there are major questions around the border from a Unionist perspective in terms of where it's going to be drawn, whether that would be a 9-county, would a 9-county north be preferable? There was fears there then that the percentage of the Catholic population would be quite high, around 40%, so that mightn't be feasible. 6 counties seemed preferable to maybe smaller, again, 4 counties, which wouldn't have enough of population to be economically viable. So there's definitely that kind of unease around the border. And then what's interesting, if we think of it aside from the Unionist leaders, on a local level, that defensiveness takes on its own form, I guess. And what we see in response to these IRA attacks around the border, this border warfare that I referred to, there's I suppose groups of vigilantes from the Unionist community that are gathering together, effectively defending the community. And that leads then to the establishment of the Special Constabulary in October 1920. So we have this the constabulary, which is this police force that really comes into being because there's already people taking this into their own hands to defend their communities. And as part of that's defensive. And one of the things, I'll give a little personal anecdote, which I think is interesting, just to think of how protecting the territory, I suppose. So we have a territory that comes into being not necessarily out of desire, but that is going to be defended nevertheless. And one of the ways this was also protected was, in certain cases anyway, was actually the expulsion of people who weren't going to satisfy or adhere to the status quo. My great-great-grandfather, James Timoney, my family from Balik, so a border area in the sense that my cousins have 4 houses in a row, and the last house is in Donegal, and the rest of the other 3 are in Fermanagh. So again, this idea of the border really being something that is drawn and very visible, and in the case of Balik, the border really goes right through the town. So the border goes along the river. But my great-great-grandfather anyway was ran a co-op, and as part of running the co-op, he would have been travelling back and forth over the what was to become the border anyway, with Donegal, and he was issued an expulsion order from the newly established government that he had 48 hours to leave the county of Fermanagh. Not necessarily politically active, but because he was associated with running a co-op that was employing potentially both Catholics and Protestants, that was seen as a potential socialist threat within this new status quo. And I only found out about this time last year because my great uncle found the original copy of the order that had been in the bottom of a drawer for about 100 years, and this wasn't something that was spoken of. And I imagine that there's many families similar that this wasn't something that was going to be addressed, particularly in the context of living in a border area and going through the last 100 years where there's been so much turbulence. But that was another way, I suppose, that this state is consolidated. So it's defensive. It is really defensive in whatever means possible. And that's just one example, I suppose, and I imagine there's more research to be done on that. In terms of what the family did, the house was also attacked, apparently. We only learnt this, and the children were sent to relatives down south and then ultimately came back to Balik, so it wasn't all dire, I guess, that they were able to return. But that was probably a pattern that was replicated on both sides of the border, where you had communities and families being uprooted because they become minorities, essentially, depending on what side of the border they land on.
Diarmaid, just come back to you here. And we've alluded to it already, but just to clarify, we've talked about the border commission, a boundary commission. Just tell us succinctly what it was.
The Boundary Commission emerged during the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations. It had been mooted gently at some points prior to that. It has been suggested that James Craig had alluded to the idea back in 1919. But as I mentioned earlier on, they were looking for a way to get over the block of the Ulster problem. And it found its way into Article 12 of the treaty, that there would be a review of the border in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants, taking into account economic and geographic considerations. Now, that clause on Article 12 would not have found its way into the Anglo-Irish Treaty unless it was vaguely worded, and it was incredibly vaguely worded. It's very interesting that Arthur Griffith had talked a lot about plebiscites, that you have to conduct plebiscites so that people can be consulted directly, who are directly affected by this, so that they would have their say. And the way he put it during the treaty negotiations in private was that, well, we wanted plebiscites, but we have a boundary commission, which is much the same. It wasn't at all the same, because there is no provision within Article 12 for consulting the people directly. And of course, the Northern Ireland government felt aggrieved about this boundary commission idea anyway. They saw it as threatening and wanted nothing to do with it and didn't want to nominate a commissioner. And, you know, the idea was that you would in some way ascertain the views of the inhabitants. Cormac mentioned there that ultimately when the commission did get up and running in 1924, that they had meetings at which they, you know, took testimony from people. So there was some engagement. But you also have the political complexion of the Boundary Commission and the commissioners themselves, because you have Richard Feetham, who's chairing it, who is a South African judge, who essentially says that he sees Northern Ireland as being the same provincial entity at the end of this process as it was at the beginning of the process. He's hardly neutral. J.R. Fisher, who is representing the Northern government, is an Ulster Unionist. He wants to get Donegal at one occasion. And then Eoin McNeill, who was the representative of the Free State Government, the Free State Government's Minister for Education, who very revealingly said nobody else could be found to act instead of me. This was not a desired job because it was such a potential minefield, and that's ultimately what it proved to be. So I suppose the wishes and hopes around the Boundary Commission from a nationalist perspective was that they would get a deal that would take a lot of territory from Northern Ireland, perhaps as much as 1/3 and 1/5 of the population, that it would make it unviable. Now, we should say that the Free State Government took it seriously. Cormac has mentioned Kevin O'Shiel, who was heading up the Northern Eastern Boundary Bureau. There are 56 boxes of archival files in relation to that, and that was partly about researching border controversies in other parts of Europe at that time, including in relation to Germany and Denmark and Poland. So, you know, they did a lot of work and they marshalled a lot of evidence. But the question of the Commission, how it was constituted and how it went about its work, it was quite clear that there was not going to be a toleration of fundamental changes to the extent that the Nationalist had wanted. And of course the mantra from James Craig, who's touring the country at the time when the Boundary Commission is sitting, is again, what we have, we hold. He later accused the Free State Government of having lived in a fool's paradise. And in some respects they did. And when the findings of the Boundary Commission were leaked in 1925, there was acute embarrassment for the Free State Government. It really was a horror show, because what was being suggested is that, yeah, you might get South Armagh, but you're going to lose East Donegal. And that, yeah, there might be an extra 31,000 people roughly coming over the border into the south, but you'd also have nearly 8,000 people going in the other direction.
And it's true, isn't it, that at no stage did the Free State Government actually interpret Article 12 as meaning that it might lose some territory.
Not at all, no. And I mean, obviously it creates a political storm then, and there's a rush to London to try and suppress it. And of course the boundary and the border remained as it was and as it has done to this day. But there was a very telling response from Kerr Healy, who was a Sinn Féin MP, who had been on the prison ship Argenta in Belfast during the Civil War. He wrote publicly to the Irish Independent, and he said, "We have been sold into political servitude for all time." And it was a desperate plea and a rebuke, and that sense that we are now on our own, that was really becoming obvious to Northern Nationalists.
We'll come back to that question in a minute. Cormac, Diarmaid spoke there about the Irish representative, or the Free State representative on the Boundary Commission, who was Eoin McNeill. It's fair to say he was the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, yeah. But W.T. Cosgrave decided that the Free State Commissioner had to be a member of the Cabinet and had to be a Catholic. And from Northern Ireland.
Ulster.
Or Ulster, and there was only two people in that category, so that was either Owen McNeill or Ernest Bly, but Ernest Bly was Protestant. So there were 7 cabinet. It's extraordinary how they chose a cabinet minister. There were only 7 cabinet ministers at the time. They were all absolutely stretched, extremely busy in their own departments. Like if we look at what Owen McNeill was doing with education, he was kind of rechanging how education is thought of, and obviously bringing in the Irish language and to its central importance. And yet he has to devote time to this boundary commission. And he wasn't from a legal background. Whereas you look at Feetham, Diarmaid referred to Richard Feetham as he wasn't a neutral observer as chairman. He was called Feetham Cheetham basically by nationalists, because all of his interpretations were pro-unionist. And then you have Joseph Fisher, who wasn't appointed by the Northern Ireland government, but Stanley Baldwin had promised James Craig, look, even if you don't appoint a commissioner, the guy we get for you will be very solid. And he was more than solid. He was leaking everything to David Reid, his wife, who was an Ulster Unionist MP. So James Craig and all of the Unionists knew exactly what was going on from the moment the Boundary Commission set. Even though 3 of them swore secrecy, they were all in private. Whereas Owen McNeill didn't
Even tell his own.
Didn't tell anyone. So the first news that Cosgrave and his cabinet gets of what was going to happen with this report was from the Morning Post, which wasn't fully accurate, but it was almost fully accurate in terms of how the boundary was going to be changed.
This is in November 1924.
Yeah. But beforehand, for whatever, Owen McNeill should never have been chosen, and he accepted that when he resigned from the commission and from the cabinet. When this, furore kicks off once people realise what's happening, and he goes, "I wasn't the right person, and I probably wasn't the right politician or diplomat." You could have said that to start on when you were appointed in July 1923. He took a very weird stance during it. He had so much deference for Feetham. So the biggest problem with the Boundary Commission wasn't Owen McNeill or Cosgrave's government. The biggest problem with the Boundary Commission was Article 12, in how it was vaguely written, and that falls on Sinn Féin. Now, I know Griffith has to take a huge amount of blame, so does Collins. They should have insisted on a plebiscite and a primacy of the wishes of the inhabitants over economic and geographic means. And they didn't do that. And they had enough evidence. It wasn't as if there had been 5 boundary commissions in Europe at the time, and all had convened before the treaty negotiations had taken place. And all of them had an independent chair, not appointed by... Now, the British said, we're an independent force here. This is the Empire, and we're the British government. But the Empire's government was the British government. So the chairperson was a British appointee, which should not have happened. The Sinn Féin delegation should not have done that. So a lot of traps were already there for McNeill, but he should have insisted at first meeting, okay, we have to agree on what the interpretation of the Article 12 is. And he didn't do that. He went along with what Feetham agreed to be interpretations. So Feetham said the Government of Ireland Act 1920 must have primacy over the treaty, which the Free State would never have agreed to that. Irish Free State can lose territory as well as gain territory. They never would have agreed to that. The units measured were the smallest possible units as opposed to counties. Again, this is advantageous to Catholics. So that all of these raft of decisions were all made that were going to skew it totally towards unionism and against Catholics. And meekly, McNeill agreed to all of this and didn't say anything. He didn't go to some of the meetings because he was busy. The 2 other commissioners were only focused on the Boundary Commission for the year or so of the sitting. When he did intervene, if you look at the witness statements and the meetings that were held all over the border areas, McNeill hardly speaks. It's all Feetham running the show, and some of the points McNeill made were irrelevant. He seemed to be in his own little world.
Poor old Owen. Are you suggesting historians don't make good politicians?
I don't know, Dermot. Let me know if you ever run.
Just looking down, we have a portrait of Owen McNeill in the boardroom of the history department that I work in, and it is possible to feel a degree of sympathy for him, but as he acknowledged himself, he wasn't really cut out for this kind of job.
Skullduggery.
In a way, he treated it as a kind of quasi-legal process.
Yeah,
he took the confidentiality thing, as you mentioned, very seriously.
But he signed off the report. The report, which is his most cardinal sin, was actually he saw what the findings were going to be, and he signed off on it. And the reason why he said was, look, I didn't want to have controversy.
But maybe his colleagues didn't do him any favours either.
Yeah, but I think they believed he actually agreed with it because he never dissented to their report. He could have written a minority report. He could have actually left the commission. He only left once it came out when it was leaked. He should have left in October 1925, or else at least written a minority report saying why he disagreed with it, not after. So he made so many mistakes, But of course, he's not the only person to blame here. There's a lot of blame to go around on the Sinn Féin side and the Cumann Gael side.
Síobhra, what was the response of Northern Nationalists when the boundary commission plans were shelved, as Diarmaid alluded there? A lot of them felt that they were being sold into servitude into perpetuity.
Yeah, well, if we think of, you can only imagine when we think that this report is leaked, that there was this expectation that the Boundary Commission would lead to substantial territory being passed over from what was now Northern Ireland into the Free State. And not only was that not going to happen, but it was actually going to be the opposite. So there was definitely huge frustration. I think in terms of the Northern Nationalist community, it's worth breaking it down, both in terms of the political elite and then also in terms of the general population. And it's also very geographically divided. So politically, there's Sinn Féin, there's also the Nationalist Party, there's also the Hibs, the Hibernians, who are the ancient order of Hibernians, who have their own, I suppose, view on all of this. If we think of the Nationalist Party led by John Devlin, based out of West Belfast, there is probably more of an acceptance of partition and less of an outcry. And this is geographic, as I mentioned, that this area in Belfast was never really in question in terms of the Boundary Commission, wasn't necessarily affected. And the view of Devlin and maybe some of the more middle-class Catholic business people in Belfast would have been more of trying to make the situation work for their own interests. But then if we look at Claire Healy, as we mentioned, who's a member of Sinn Féin, elected Sinn Féin, was in their Argenta prison ship representing Fermanagh Tyrone. This was absolutely outrageous that this could occur, because the area he's representing was an area that potentially could have become part of the Free State. And as Diarmaid mentioned, he said that this was akin to being sold into political servitude. So there's a real soreness on the part of the Nationalists on the border. And even if we see in terms of their engagement with the state and going into government, Claire Healy doesn't go into government until the late 1920s, and said he was too sore to go in up to that point. So there's that split. And then I think just in terms of, to move away, I suppose, from the political leaders, in terms of the people on a day-to-day, that this was obviously something that affected them hugely in the border areas, equally across the north and in the cities as well. It's also at the aftermath of a very violent period. In Belfast, we had expulsions from the shipyards, Catholic workers being expelled from their jobs. We also had a third of the Catholic population being essentially uprooted from their homes, about 23,000. Many of them come down south before returning. So this is all the upheaval that's been happening. And I think sometimes that for maybe the ordinary people, the main priority was survival, perhaps. With the Gaeltacht writer from Donegal, Seamus O'Green, he was an anti-treaty Republican interned in the Curragh, but he wrote a novel in the 1930s, and in the novel the characters mock and say, well, what occurred, what happened over the course of the revolution, all that changed was the colour of the soldier's uniform, essentially. So I suppose that question comes to what was the day-to-day change in realities. And that really brings us to the fact that in the north there was a very difficult situation for the average nationalist in the years that followed, that this was a state then where Catholics were less likely to gain employment, where housing conditions were poorer. We have so much upheaval in terms of people being relocated. We still see that based in Belfast. So you still see the geography of the city is so separated because of this upheaval from the 1920s and people being placed into certain areas. So I really think that this was definitely a very sore period for Northern Nationalists, but also a period where survival was what most people were probably concerned with.
But there's also a lot of divisions within the nationalist community about how to handle it. It's very difficult for people like Joseph Devlin, who have that background in nationalist politics, predating all of this, to try and keep different factions together. And you mentioned Claire Healy there. Like, what's their attitude supposed to be or going to be to politics in Northern Ireland? But Claire Healy also said something revealing at the time, as well as decrying the abandonment. He said, none of you understand the Northern mind. And like that actually predates partition, that sense of a distance. You know, some of the Antrim volunteers during the Civil War felt that, you know, the way one of them put it, none of you in Dublin understand our dilemma. there were various versions of that. And we can focus, of course, on Sinn Féin mistakes during that period. Cormac's gone through them. But there's also British duplicity at the heart of this question, the impressions that they gave, the conveniences for them, because in the words of Austin Chamberlain, they don't want the Irish question to be a fatal influence on British politics. So, I mean, they did what they needed to do to try and get this off their table and left others to deal with the mess. And, you know, there are continuities, you could argue, in relation to that approach. But there is that sense as well that when Northern Nationalists come to Dublin to plead with people like Kevin O'Higgins, for example, the delegations that come down during this period, they're pretty much told the only way you'll deal with this is through, in Kevin O'Higgins' words, strenuous voluntary effort. Such has got us to the position where we were able to create our free state. There's a real sense of the washing of Southern hands there.
Yes.
And of course that manifests itself at various stages in subsequent decades. And like, you can still see even people who became prominent in public life in the Republic at a much later stage, who came from Northern Ireland. I'm thinking of people like Mary McAleese or Susan McKay. They've referred to the distaste that existed for speaking about this issue, both its history and its contemporary manifestations. It brings you into that whole space of a partitionist mentality and what it does psychologically as the border becomes cemented. That sense of up there and down here. And there are moments of great cross-border empathy and sympathy, but there's always that priority of not allowing all of these difficulties to destabilise the South.
You've kind of answered my last question. I was going to ask all three, so I'll just because I want to get in some questions as well. Cormac, very briefly, if you can, there's a sense, and Diarmaid alluded to it there, of Northern Nationalists being sold out by the South in this time period. Is that a fair perception?
It was obviously very complicated. The whole Ulster question is the most complicated part of the whole Irish question for decades. You know, it dominated British politics from the 1880s up until the 1920s, when they did kind of get out and let the two Irish factions at each other, as they described it, although they were pumping loads and loads of money into the Northern faction. Look, they were in bind, all strains of nationalism, but as Diarmaid alluded to, there was no unity there within nationalism. And I actually am struck by how roles have reversed in some ways. There's very little unity in unionism today, and there's a kind of, it seemed a strident unity to some degree in nationalism, but it's more clear in its path, nationalism, whereas unionism is all over the place today. But I look at the Sinn Féin, and I even look at the Nationalist Party, the Irish Party, and they were all over the place with the North, particularly Sinn Féin. They had no good policies on the North. Their policies were the Belfast boycott, as Síobhra mentioned, which was a horrendous policy. It actually made permanent partition more likely than less likely. And then they followed on with the bringing in customs posts. I think Ernest Bligh was onto something when he said, look, the destructionist tactics aren't working. There's maybe no chance of recognising the North working, but there's absolutely zero chance of getting United Ireland if we keep on these obstruction tactics and coercion. So coercion was ruled out, and rightly so too. Coercion was not going to work because there was just so much money and personnel pumped into Northern Ireland for any army or force in the South to have any chance of success. So they should have tried the other method, which was get on better with the North and have a proper relationship with the North. The Council of Ireland was alluded to.
Yeah,
that was shelved. Like nationalists from the 60s onwards were crying out for a Council of Ireland, whereas the nationalists of the 1920s didn't want to have anything to do with the Council of Ireland because they were looking over their backs all the time because they were considered partitionists if they dealt with the North. The Free State government actually had relationships, particularly in agriculture. There was common policies on foot and mouth disease and other animal diseases, and they worked closely together, but behind closed doors. The RUC and the Gardaí worked together in terms of the border was such a meandering route that they actually were allowed to go over each other's territories and back. Same with postmen, they were able to go back and forth. But all of this is kept secret because they didn't want the anti-republicans to...
Síobhra, do you think nationalists were sold out at that time period?
Well, I think what we've referred to is there's duplicity on the part of the British government, but equally that leads to this the very complicated relationships between the Republican movement, between the Free State government and Northern Nationalists. We have quite a high percentage of IRA activists in the North side with the treaty, pro-treaty side, with the idea that the treaty is a stepping stone. So they definitely feel sold out, particularly after the death of Michael Collins, and when it becomes abundantly clear then that the Free State government is following, I suppose, the terms of the treaty, and then that is even more of a failure than when the Boundary Commission is revealed and that nothing has been gained. So I think from the perspective of Northern Nationalists, it really is a devastating situation for them on multiple levels, at multiple stages. And what it really boils down to is a sense for them that they are doubly marginalised. Not only are they marginalised within Northern Ireland as the minority, but equally within an All-Ireland idea that they are cut off from the nationalists in the south. And I think the legacies of that to the present are still very profound.
Okay. So we have time for a few questions. I'd ask people to keep it to questions rather than statements and keep the questions short. Anybody wish to ask a question? Keep their hand up. Well, I'll come to you next. Do we have a microphone? Have a microphone? Would you mind standing up there, sir? Okay, that's a statement. Now this chap has a question.
To what extent did the proportion of the UK national debt, which the Free State had to pay, contribute to the deliberations of the partition of the Commission dealing with partition?
So you're asking a question there about this is the portion of the Free State debt for the UK imperial debt.
Tri-part agreement.
Yeah. Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, well, so basically when Cosgrave and O'Higgins rush over to London to get the Boundary Commission report shelved, they actually, O'Higgins said, look, we want to help the nationalist minority. That was what he wanted to do initially. And even Lord Salisbury, Conservative peer, he actually said there should be an ombudsman for Catholics in the North, just, as a way to, and he suggested to Joseph Devlin being that ombudsman, and get rid of the specials, and all of these things were suggested. But Craig was, to use Dermot's phrase, what we have we hold. Not an inch actually became his mantra, not an inch. There was even a plaque in Newcastle offered to him with not an inch on it after he succeeded with the tripartite agreement. He'd said, no, well, I'm not giving any of those. But I suggest that we ease your debt to Cosgrave and O'Higgins. And look, they didn't want that. They wanted to help nationalists, but they go, okay, we will. I think it was £5 million at the time was actually offered the easing of the debts. Actually, the biggest obstacle to that agreement was actually Churchill. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, and he didn't want to do it. So it was kind of a last-minute conference between Cosgrave, Craig, and Churchill that brought that.
So it's not really part of the Boundary Commission procedures. It's something that arises to deal with the fallout from the Boundary Commission as opposed to driving the Boundary Commission.
This lady here is the question.
I was going to ask, to what extent were the negotiations at the time being considered from the British viewpoint as a testing ground for, obviously, about Ireland, but more importantly about its bigger jewels that they had already invaded. So for thinking particularly about obviously partition of India. So I mean, many of the policies are very similar: divide and conquer, the use of religious sectarianism. It's all repeated on industrial scale in other parts of the world. So how much of the actual negotiations weren't just about the Unionists per se, but the idea that should they actually grant something that obviously, if this was repeated on a larger scale, particularly in India, that they would have bigger problems and bigger fish to fry. So this is kind of like a testing ground or a dummy run, for the want of a word. So what kind of evidence is there in the in the negotiations at the time that they were, I suppose, not just considering the context of Ireland, but the context of whatever they do in Ireland.
Of the empire in general.
Yeah, in general, but for India in particular, because it's been replicated there.
Who wants to take this?
I say Diarmaid's written about this.
Just briefly, because there's a lot in that, obviously. Sometimes I call this the Ellis Island reminder. You know, when Irish tourists go over to Ellis Island, they're reminded that they're part of a much bigger story of migration. And the same is true if you go into the British archives now for 1923 and you realise how insignificant Ireland is. I mean, obviously it has dominated British politics to a degree that they do not want. But in 1923, you're talking about a British Empire of some 460 million people. It's so vast, it's so complicated. And when the Irish issue emerges, it's coming in the midst of discussions about Palestine and Greece and various other parts of the empire. And it's not that they were, using Ireland as a template. They do see Ireland as an exception in some ways. But there were those who were worried too about precedents being set. But I don't think they are working out models for future partitions on the back of what's going on there. But certainly some of the same themes emerge again. What remains an important theme really is how do you disengage without those divisions manifesting themselves in a violent way in particular. So it remained a very important challenge. And of course they did leave other parts of the empire when they were forced to in an absolute mess.
Just on that, I think the British actually saw, before the Troubles broke out, they actually saw the Ireland partition as a success story. And they did adopt similar models with Palestine, Israel, and India, Pakistan, and let the two warring factions kind of work out their own mess together. It's worked well in Ireland, so let's try it in India and Israel, Palestine. And as we know, all three did not work, but they definitely did see initially for the first 50 years or so as the Irish story being a success.
We have time for one last question. This gentleman in white over there.
Yeah, just in terms of, you were talking about plebiscites earlier on. In that period of the mid-1920s, do we know if plebiscites had been taken, which 6 counties would have wanted to join the south and which would have wanted to stay in the north? Do we have that information, or can we make an educated guess on it?
Oh yeah,
go on ahead.
Yeah, but 1911 was the last census taken, and there was a clear majority in Fermanagh and Tyrone, and there was no census done, but there was local elections essentially of the period. And you did have majority nationalists, whether it was local government or in the for Northern Ireland, Parliament or Westminster. Those constituencies always had nationalists returned over Unionists essentially. Even if you include the gerrymandering tactics used by the Northern government from 1922 onwards, there still was a majority in those 2 counties.
Okay, that's all. We have now the launch of the Dublin.
Outside
historian in residence.
You're all welcome.
Yes. And listen, thank you so much for coming here this morning. Thank you to my panel, Diarmaid Ferriter, Cormac Moore and Síobhra Aiken. Thank you so much.
Great timing, Ronan. Right on time, good timing. Bang on time.